Jen, you can see everybody on here. We are the stalwarts of WILPF and Raging Grannies in San Jose, and we welcome you. And I want to introduce you. And to do that, I'm just going to reflect on how I met you. Jen is currently at Surge. And Surge had something this summer called, I think it was called Connections, something like that. And they had longtime Surgers open to people newish like me for conversations, one-to-one conversations. Can I tell you, this is a wonderful community building technique to do. I suggest WILPF to do this. And so I spoke up and said, I'd love to have some conversations. And Jen responded. And we had a lovely conversation. I think it was the first time, and maybe the first time in COVID, I had eaten at a restaurant. We were outdoors, but it's been that kind of year. And we just talked about everything. And what came up was, one of the things that came up was WILPF. And that's how I found out about Jen's interest in Jane Addams and the Spiderweb document or chart, whatever it's called. And with that little history of how I met Jen, please let me welcome Jen and the Jane Addams, WILPF, and the Spiderweb chart, a bit of history. Jen?
Before we get the slide deck up, I'll just give you a little bit. I have like a very odd and strange path that has brought me to you today. I am currently a community organizer, but for most of my adult life, I have been a sociologist. And as a sociologist, I taught at De Anza College for 20 years. And I, in my first sabbatical there, had proposed that I called it Recovering the Lost Canon. I wanted to find out about the early social scientists who were either white women or men or women of color. And in that project, I discovered Jane Addams, who really should be seen and should be taught as one of the American founding mothers of sociology, as far as I'm concerned. She is a towering figure in the social sciences. And I just got interested, and Jane became a kind of a hero to me as I learned and read more. And I've read almost everything that she has. Maybe I've read everything she's written. That's how I first discovered Jane Addams, okay? But about 10 years into that career, I also became a filmmaker. And thanks to becoming a filmmaker, I became a history archive nerd. And that is really what brings me to you today, because it was the filmmaking that got me to the Spiderweb. All right, so I'm going to try to reconstruct how that happened, show you a bunch of his archival stuff, just cool things that I learned about Jane Addams, about WILPF, about the time period. Also, I am an archive nerd now, so I will be doing just a little bit of boosterism from why it's amazing to look at historical documents. I'm trying to make some connections to today. And we agreed, I had got some feedback from some folks here that I have a rough cut of the film, but I'm not going to show it tonight. I'm going to talk about it, but I'd be happy to share a password. It's very rough, a password protected access to it if you get your interest piqued and you're like, I really want the whole story. So that's my plan. And now I will ask Rowan if you might pull up the slide deck, because the story for me of how I came to the Spiderweb started with a school assignment, believe it or not, and that led me to a quest. And so you can go to the next slide. This is literally, it's very blurry, but this is literally an assignment I got. I was doing a graduate credential in documentary filmmaking, and we got an assignment to not make a historical documentary, but write the whole script for it and get all the materials for it, okay? And it had to be during the motion picture era. Yeah, you can keep going. which meant that I couldn't tell the story of Hull House, which I'd been kind of flirting with that whole time in the program, because Hull House to me is like also just an amazing experiment in democracy, and I have so much admiration for it. Okay, you can go to the next slide, because certainly our blurriness. So I had to find something that was in, motion pictures started in the 1890s, right? So I needed to actually, like, just after Hull House, it was like, oh, dang it, just a little too late. And I had come across just the story of actually, like, the women who slightly predate WILPF going to Europe in World War I to try to stop the war. And I was like, man, that's some serious ovaries right there. Like, I just love that story. So I was reading, right? And this gives you a sense of, like, some of the things that I was starting to read. And it really was in Kim Nielsen's book, Un-American Womanhood. I think that where I first was like, oh, this Spiderweb document is, how do I not know about this? How did I never learn about this? Which is the thing I've had through much of my adult life, is like learning something and being like, how was I never taught about this? And so let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I was debating how much of this kind of timelining stuff to do, but I just feel like I want to set the stage, because I'm not going to go into all this stuff on the, like, I'm not going to cover all of this, but I just want to set up, because my story really takes place in the early 1920s, okay? But when you learn about the first Red Scare in history classes, they say it went from 1919 to 1920. But actually, the story of how the government red-baited WILPF really comes to a head in 1923 and 1924. And I think it's like a kind of like a gendered understanding of the first Red Scare to say it was from 1919 to 1920, because the US government, like, was actively smearing feminist pacifists into the 1920s and beyond, right? And it didn't end. The first Red Scare did not end. And so, but there's things that sort of set this up, right? So,
veteran political journalist and host of the podcast.
All right. So World War I starts, right? And feminist peace activism kind of coalesces, and Jane Addams and a bunch of women literally go to Europe to try to broker an end to the war, which is, like, amazing. They did not succeed, but still, you got to love that. And then, of course, we entered the war in 1917. The Bolshevik Revolution also happens that year, and that makes a lot of capitalists in the US very, very nervous when that happens. But because we were in the war, two things happened. Two acts got passed: the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, that really undermined civil liberties, okay? And ended up being used as a way to attack progressives across all kinds of progressives, right, in this period right after. Like the IWW, the Wobblies, the very, very radical multiracial union, got raided. This is when the ACLU, what is now the ACLU, got founded. Jane Addams, of course, one of those founders. And there, 1919, there was a general strike in Seattle. That made people very nervous post-Bolshevik Revolution, that, like, the revolution was going to happen here, right? And then we also, just to note, this is also a period of tremendous racial violence, white collective violence against people of color, against Black people. And I think, as I've, like, delved into this little period post-World War I into the sort of the mid-1920s, the blueprint for the kind of very hard fascist conservatism that has marked our time now really got set 100 years ago, like almost to the day, you know what I mean? We're in 2021, but, like, those blueprints really were laid during this time period. So Edgar Hoover, at the age of 24, got put in charge of the General Intelligence Division, and he started surveilling progressives. The military intelligence inside the military in the War Department was surveilling US citizen civilians. I will show you some amazing documents, right? Women win the right to vote. Everyone gets really nervous about what that's going to mean, right? And in fact, the feminist pacifists won huge cuts to the military budget. The military budget shrunk tremendously from 1919 into the early 1920s. So the War Department had reason to be concerned. And it's really 1923 that the Spiderweb document gets created. In 1924, that white nationalist Henry Ford leaks it, gets leaked to him, and he publishes it in his newspaper. Which also 1924, just side note, happens to be the year of the Racist Immigration Act, the Quota Act of 1924, which was authored by white nationalist Madison Grant. And so you have this like very anti-labor, anti-feminist, anti-civil rights, anti-people of color, like just wave that really takes over in the 1920s. So that's my time period that I'm like just fascinated by. It's a century ago, and it's sometimes you feel like you could be reading today. You know what I mean? From some of the rhetoric, like the use of surveillance to break down progressives, right? And really what is a proto-fascism in the US that is like led by capitalist elites, white capitalist elite males, really hanging on to the, because you know, like one of the big reasons why they hated labor is like child, like the, and feminism is because of child labor laws, right? Which is like this patriarchal idea about like, what can you do? You know, you get to have ownership over your children. So anyway, I could go on and on and on about that, but let's get to the fun stuff. So by the way, please stop me. You see, I get on a roll, but I don't mind stopping and answering questions or taking comments along the way. So just putting that out there. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I mentioned I was a little bit of a archives nerd, and so I wanted to share some of the cool / sometimes horrifying things you find when you start poking about in old newspaper archives. Okay, so next slide. Okay, you might be wondering what you're looking at here and why. You're like, what is this, Jen? But this is a thing that is like a thing when I would teach my students about Jane Addams. I was like, I need you to wrap your mind around this. When you put Jane Addams into the New York Times historical database, okay, and you bound that by her lifespan, okay, really, and I actually put her adult lifespan. The New York Times has over 1,300 articles about Jane Addams. Just like think about that for a second, right? Like she was, I think, the most famous woman in America, and she was famous not because she was an entertainer, like for instance, Oprah, right? But as a political figure. And for much of her life, women had no political rights. You know what I mean? So like part of like Jane Addams just is someone who really transcended so many of the very hardcore limits that were placed on someone like her. So this is a thing you can find when you look in newspaper archives. Can we go to the next slide? I think this may be what one of my this is what maybe one of my most favorite things I ran across. This is an article in the New York Times in which the headline says Jane Addams has bronchitis. Just like Jane Addams's bronchitis made the New York Times. And I mean, can you think of any woman alive today whose bronchitis would make the news? Only maybe Kamala Harris, right? I mean, like, you know, so like, I think it's like, it was this moment when like seeing this article for reals, where I was like, oh, I literally never was taught a single thing about Jane Addams in school, right? But she was actually such a public figure that her bronchitis got covered in the New York Times. And that is like such a lesson about the erasure of women in our history. It's like sometimes people say, well, women didn't do anything, which we all know is a bold-faced lie. But in this case, like she literally was hella famous and still got erased. You know what I mean? So by the time I'm in school, I learned nothing about her. Yeah. Oh, hence cool / horrifying. You know what I mean? Okay, next slide. Oh, look at those peace activists. You can spot Jane in the front row, seated there, wearing a hat, much like some of the women right here in this room. I mean, look at all of them in their amazing hats. It's delightful. It's amazing. I love catching sight of her. I've seen many images of her. If you hit the next slide, Rowan, probably y'all may be already familiar with this image, maybe. It certainly has made the rounds. This was from that trip to Europe to try to end World War I, right? So I have sat in many archives and looked at many a photograph. And of course, you can find many of these if you're interested in the Swarthmore Peace Collection online. The Library of Congress has many, many photographs of Jane Addams. And now, thanks to our digital revolution, many of these things they're just right there waiting for you when you poke around a little bit. Let's do the next slide. Just some things sort of getting at, right? This, like, look at how many columns, you know what I mean? Look at that, look at how many columns, right? Devoted to Jane Addams, devoted to peace activism. I mean, just try to imagine that. Try to imagine an article this long devoted to peace activism now, right? Like, I don't think we can really wrap our mind around actually how motivated Americans were in this time period around peace. It almost seems kind of sweet or something, you know, given our jaded state of affairs here in 2021. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is once again really the coverage. Like, they not only went to Europe, but they got news coverage for what they were trying to do, right? And remember, this is before women had the vote in the US. Yeah. Okay, next slide. Here is what got me, right? I was reading about the spider web, but this really got me right here. And I actually own a copy of this in paper form. This is the a copy of Henry Ford's newspaper in which the news, like the leak happened, the news broke. And I'm going to use the word news really lightly here because it's just outright lies, right? But the spider web broke, and this was the headline, right? Do Bolsheviks use our women's clubs, right? And there was just something about, I mean, I just, you know, just that giant headline. I mean, it's quite large. It takes up the whole above the fold in that newspaper, right? And I was like, 1924, right? When I was in school, I was taught that women got the vote, and then kind of feminism died out because women got the vote. That's what I was taught. That's the narrative I was taught. Like, oh, they won the thing, and then people kind of weren't interested anymore. And it turned out that it was really red baiting and like concentrated efforts on the part of the US government that broke the women's movement, like deliberately, is what I've learned. And that is quite a thing to think about, and also not something I was taught in school. Yeah. So let's go to the next slide. Some more fun things you learn that you find. This is one of my favorites. Look at this little bottom on the left-hand side. This is when the kind of military really starts agitating against feminist pacifism, right? And they literally do like a whole PR campaign around this. And there's like giant military parades popping up all over the country. And then they're doing hardcore surveillance. I love this line: veteran predicts Jane Addams as president if things continue as they are. Oh no. Anyway, you know, they were perhaps right to be worried because the progressive forces were very powerful. But I love that line. Just the like hand wringing and dastardly fear of that. Next slide. One thing I learned is that as I started to kind of go down the rabbit hole of learning about the spider web, that there were two real villains involved, like two actual people, like two dudes who really kind of spearheaded what ended up bringing down the women's movement. And one of them is a man named John Weeks, who became head of the War Department. That's him. This is another little just shout out for our digitized archives now, is that like you can actually find like actual motion picture footage that you can download in the privacy of your own home. Although I will say there's nothing quite as thrilling as being in the National Archives when they hand you a canister from 1921 and then they leave you in the room with it. You're like, is this safe? This doesn't seem smart. John Weeks was an anti-suffragist senator in New York who got defeated by the feminists who ran a suffragist against him. And boy, did he hate women. And so when he became head of the War Department, it was actually very personal for him, his attacks on feminist pacifism. And then the other villain of my piece is someone who gets referenced in our next slide. And this is a man named General Amos Fry, who literally wrote the book on chemical warfare. He was a giant fan and booster for chemical weapons in World War I. Like, he was so excited about it, he literally wrote a whole book about it. And needless to say, public opinion about chemical warfare was extremely negative, right? And so he was like really kind of at a loss post-war for kind of how to keep like, you know, his success and his interest going. And he was a real innovator, y'all. So I have to say, on this next slide, you're going to see something I found that literally made my jaw drop, okay? Which is, it turns out that the man who was behind the making of the Spiderweb document is also the man responsible for training our police force to use chemical weapons on civilians in the US. Think about that for a hot second. I found this article, this was the spring of 2016, after, much like in 2020, there had been a whole series of police murders of Black men. And then I realized that the villain in this film I'm working on is really the man who really was responsible for introducing chemical warfare as a tactic of suppression here in the US. So there's little Amos Fry's at the end of this. Now notice, like, it doesn't say Amos Fry's on the top. Like, it takes a lot of like serendipity and digging, right? When to find these little bits, these little kind of things that help me piece the story together. Oh, Amos Fry's and John Weeks. So they make excellent villains in terms of a film. They're like basically almost mustache twirling level of villainy, the two of them. And Amos Fry's was also so John Weeks was kind of a hardcore anti-feminist, misogynist, but Amos Fry's, in addition to his love for chemical warfare, was rabidly anti-communist, like for the next, like he got into it with the PTA because he thought communists had infiltrated the PTA in the later half of the 1920s. I mean, he just was like, saw communists around every corner. You know, if only. Anyway, okay, let's go on to the next slide. This is another indication of just how famous Jane Addams was. So this is just a screenshot from Newspaperscom, which is like maybe the best online archive of all the little newspapers across the whole country. And if you once again put Jane Addams's name in and then her adult years, there are 85,000 stories that pop. Okay, so Jane Addams was getting covered everywhere, which also meant that when the Spiderweb document got leaked, it also got covered everywhere. So that's the next slide. So it was in newspapers.com that I started to realize that, you know how like the Associated Press might write a story and then it ends up in like all these local papers. The coverage of the Spiderweb document, which I know you're like, but we haven't even seen it yet and you've barely talked about it. I'm just building the suspense, y'all. It ended up in tiny papers all across America. And when I talked to Kim Nielsen, the author of Un-American Womanhood, she was like, oh yeah, people were talking about this in their like hair salons. Like she had found in a tiny town in Ohio that she was studying for a whole nother reason, references to the Spiderweb chart. Like, so as a form of propaganda, it really like hit places all across the US. Okay, just a little bit of fun next in terms of things that you find while you're looking in the archives. Next slide. Oh, I love this. Look at that. Do they laugh at your skinny body? These are the fun things you can discover when you're doing historical research, where you're like, yes, it turns out beauty norms are a social construction, because in 1928, they would have made fun of your skinny body. And that is something in terms of the serendipity of history. If you go to the next slide, I was not obviously looking for ads like that. I was looking for this thing around how the Daughters of the American Revolution became basically a tool of the War Department. And so I was looking for one thing, but then you're like looking in these old newspapers and you're like, this is fascinating. So you can really go down the historical rabbit hole if you're into that sort of thing. So let me pause now because I'm going to take you next into the military intelligence files, but just I'm curious if anyone has questions about any of the bits about just like how influential Jane was and also the cool things you can learn when you start looking in old newspapers.
Wow, we're breathless, and you're the one who's been talking. Whoa.
So since we count the founding of WILPF from that trip to The Hague, we know a lot about it, and we know a lot about Jane. So that's not a surprise. And
Not
I'm a
as much as
retired
you
librarian,
do.
as is Joan. So newspaper archives are not any strangers to us either, I suspect.
Yay. Awesome. Good, good. That is marvelous. Well, then maybe this next bit will be even more intriguing, because unless you've gone into the National Archives and dug into the military intelligence microfiche, you might not have seen these things, but they are amazing. So let us take a look at the next slide. Okay, cool things you can learn when poking about military intelligence files in the National Archives. Next slide.
We have an active WILPF member who in St. Louis who works at the National Archives, building, whatever you call it there.
Yeah.
In St. Louis. I'm just dying to tell her about all this.
Oh,
See if
yeah.
she's aware of it already.
It is really fun. So the military intelligence files, the military is not supposed to be gathering intelligence on American citizens, but they did. They call it negative intelligence when they're studying their own people. And this is the first page of Jane Addams's military intelligence file, which is all on microfiche. So that you go into the, I don't know, some of you may recall that the magic of microfiche, and they had quite a long file on her, pages and pages, I will say. She also has a fairly sizable FBI file. But the military intelligence files were something that I didn't even know existed until I started working on this project. And there's some really fun things in here. So these, I'm going to show you just some of the pages and we'll go through them somewhat quickly, but I just wanted to highlight some of the things that they were like, watch out. Like, so her loyalty was suspected, right? Her loyalty to the US because she was a peace activist, right? So that is like something to note, that like that alone was like reason to suspect her loyalty. Next slide. Okay, they have these little notes, right? Fellowship of Reconciliation, like, oh no, not that. So dangerous. Watch out, everybody. Next slide. She was someone who was active in the Immigrants Protective League. Once again, oh no, not that. Right? Clearly worthy of suspicion. Also, just note in terms of like the anti-immigrant sentiment post-World War I and the ways in which it really is a mirror to our present time, right? In terms of like the particular form that conservatism is taking during this time. She spoke on food conditions in Europe. That clearly makes her dangerous, right? So, I mean, I just love some of the little notations, and, it's a fantasy of mine to try to go back in at some point and see if you can find the like personality of the people keeping these files, like what things that they were intrigued by, How about the next? Prominently identified with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Also clearly suspicious, right? WILPF. Reason to be,
Ooh,
right?
International president.
Watch out, internationalism. It's going to bring down the American government. That's what they thought. They really thought. They really were worried, right? And, the progressive movement really did have a lot of headway, right? So, I mean, it's an interesting thing because they were right to be worried about women getting the vote, right? They were right to be worried about the labor movement, right? They were right to be worried about Black civil rights activism in terms of what it was going to mean for the elite white men at the top, right? So they had a lot of fear, and boy, did they use their power to crush that. If you already know about Jane Addams, then you probably already know this story, but this is a little notation about when she got back from Europe and then made in a speech, in a very kind of, thousands of people would greet her upon return. She talked about how one of the soldiers she had met mentioned that he had needed to get drunk in order to kill anybody. And that was like led to a firestorm of hatred against her, like death threats, and like it was like in some ways like a radical undermining of her reputation, and something that she struggled quite a lot with. just to have the temerity of suggesting that people aren't natural killers, that they have to be trained. Yeah. Okay, how about the next slide? This, I think, is a point I want to make about, so the Espionage and Sedition Acts really kind of gave license for Americans to spy on other Americans. Okay, so in this period that I am interested in of the first Red Scare, a lot of the notations in these files come from what are basically conservative organizations spying on progressives and writing letters to the military about like, oh, we saw this, and this person is suspicious for this reason. And so you can see here that the War Department was getting its intel about Jane Addams from the industrial, I forget what the DEF stands for, but it's just a manufacturers association, basically, right? Corporate heads spying on progressives, right? And the War Department soliciting these. And there were all kinds of basically sort of white nationalist organizations that were feeding the War Department information, anti-labor organizations, anti-feminist organizations that were just totally spying on progressives. And the War Department was sometimes actively soliciting that spying. And then on the next slide, you'll see my personal favorite little notation they made about Jane. Agitator against war. Yes. Oh, just amazing.
1932.
Yeah, I know. Amazing, right? Yeah, so good. You can see also here little shout outs around like, does this organization have connections with the IWW, right? So like really sort of looking at like progressivism as this whole kind of revolutionary force.
And that's, 1932, that's the Depression.
Yeah.
And they had to worry about somebody being against war.
I know. And it's fascinating, isn't it? But it's something where like, I think about like, if you look at the documents they were writing, like the things that the feminist pacifists were writing about how the terms of World War I should have ended, right? And that, those were not the terms, but the terms that did end the war kind of set up fascism in Europe. And you look and you think like, if WILPF had actually been successful, if the terms that they had suggested had actually been adopted, the whole course of the 20th century might have changed, right? So, it's just interesting around like, the what ifs, right? That could have happened. Let's go 2 slides ahead, because I couldn't help myself. I went to the military intelligence files to look for things on Jane Addams, on some of the other women in WILPF, Emily Balch, right? For, Florence Kelly from Hull House, right? I was looking for sort of the feminist pacifists, but once I was like in with the microfiche, then I was like, let's see who else I can find in here. And so in case you were curious who else was military intelligence surveilling, I thought I would give you a quick tour, because you really can see this idea that progressives in general were under surveillance. Hull House, right, had a file. League of Women Voters, famous for their radical revolutionary positions, right? Ida Wells Barnett, right? Jeanette Rankin, under surveillance while she was actually in the House of Representatives.
One of the several times.
Yeah. Yep. That's Philip Randolph. Philip Randolph, African-American labor organizer, under surveillance. Mother Jones, perhaps unsurprisingly in Mother Jones's case. The Ladies' Home Journal, another one of my personal favorites. Now, to be fair to the Ladies' Home Journal, it was much more radical back then than it is today. And Jane Addams was published in the Ladies' Home Journal. I used to assign my students if men were seeking the franchise, which was, I believe, a Ladies' Home Journal, published in the Ladies' Home Journal, but that makes me laugh. I love the Suspect over it, Suspect, the Ladies' Home Journal. Langston Hughes, the poet. Got to watch out for those poets, y'all. this is more from Langston Hughes's, some of the notations, right? Member of committee who selected Negroes to go to Russia to make film, reputed proletarian poet.
Reputed.
Yeah, reputed. New official organ of American League Against War and Fascism. Yeah. Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Okay. Another feminist. John Dewey, someone who I also would consider a founding father of American sociology, but general humanist, progressive. We should not be surprised, I suppose, that Alice Paul was under surveillance by military intelligence. After all, she was a friend of Emma Goldman and an IWW agitator, according to the notations, and was director of the National Women's Party unpatriotic organization. Yeah. So like feminism just defined as unpatriotic, right? Which also like has so much resonance, right? Today about like Americanness, right? What does it mean to be for America? Yeah. And then next, this is a page from someone else I also tremendously admire, personal hero of mine, W.E.B. Du Bois, another founding sociologist. And this is a line too that I just think is like, in terms of like what it was that was seen as threatening. And here, they make a note that he was going to lecture primarily to arouse colored people to intelligent thought on their present problems, right? So it's just like amazing to spend time with military intelligence files. I don't know what to say. It was like simultaneously like mortifying and horrifying and fascinating and like almost made me gleeful too, just to like have access to it, right? That these files are there, that you can look at them, right? But you're probably wondering, what about the spider web itself? Was I ever going to find it? Boy, I sure looked for it, y'all. I sure looked for it. I looked and I looked and I looked. I saw copies, photocopies, basically, of it. And I looked in a lot of places. So next slide. These are just some fun things of like, everywhere I went, I was like, look, here's boxes I looked through. You know what I mean? I looked in Chicago. I looked at Swarthmore. I hung out for a little while. I think I might even have pictures of the Jane Addams project in the tiny little university, Ramapo University, that is digitizing all of Jane Addams's papers, which is amazing, which they are doing out of a tiny, tiny office shoved in with like one staff member and a couple interns. Just boxes and boxes, right? So I was looking, right? So graphics from archival collections, Art and War and Peace, like, the labeling, like I tried searching Spiderweb, just nothing, right? Just nothing with that label, right? So I really was like, I'm just looking at stuff now. You know what I mean? Like just seeing what I got, looking through boxes, trying to find things like, it's just a lot of just of a kind of a grind. Just want to highlight Jane Addams' signature. Sometimes, like when I was at Hull House, I looked at her, I think it was at Hull House, or was it? Might have been at the University of Illinois archives. I got to see her bookkeeping records, just like as WILPF members, I think, like for Hull House, like she was keeping the books while also lecturing, being an agitator, an activist. Like she was running a nonprofit. She was like like a CEO of a nonprofit. It's just, I don't know. It's like amazing to see. This is Emily Balch too, always cordially yours at the bottom. There's like something about seeing their hands, right? Just like, I don't know, it's very moving to me to be in the places where they were and see their, like, there's like a little piece of Jane somehow, to see her hands like that. More archival things. And I'm just like literally was going through stuff one at a time. Next slide. This is on this next slide is at that digitizing project for all the Jane Addams papers. They literally had like their catalog in this like binder on paper. I was like, y'all need to digitize faster. What if there's a fire? That like, this was the index to all their things. They probably have a lot more digitized. By the time I was there, I think they had gotten just up to 1923. But I bet you they're further now because this was several years back. So I'm still looking on my journey. I interview, so you can go to the next slide. I get to talk to, in Toledo, Ohio, Kim Nielsen. who wrote Un-American Womanhood, an amazing book, by the way. Like, she is a historian, but unlike, I think, a lot of history books, which to me sometimes get bogged down in the details, she has a very clear-headed analysis of the anti-progressive politics in the early 1920s. I highly recommend as a read. I mean, I know I'm a little nerdy, so maybe I shouldn't recommend it so highly because not everyone is as nerdy as me, but it is amazing. And she is amazing. And then I also got to spend an afternoon with, on the next slide, Jane Addams' biographer, who was in Evanston, Illinois. And like, I took some photographs of her amazing library. And she is like, also was fast. Like, I feel like it was the closest I would ever get to come to meeting Jane Addams, was getting to talk to Louise Knight. But still, I had not uncovered the Spiderweb document. Let's actually see what it was I was looking for. That's the next slide. Oh, there it is. I'm not sure there was ever a single piece of propaganda more pernicious and lie-filled and effective as this. And it's like so dumb in its genius. This is what amazes me. Because all this is, I mean, it's just fascinating. The secretary for Amos Fry's, Lucia Maxwell, was asked to compile this. Okay, she was also very anti-communist. I don't know why else she hated the women's movement. I'm sure she was an anti-suffragist. All this is a list of women's organizations with a bunch of lines connecting them. Like, just think about that for a second. Like, it's not data. You know what I mean? It has no data. It is just literally a collection of lines. And at the top, it's basically has the question, right? The socialist you guys can't quite see, I can't quite see it on the screen, but the very, very top, the heading just says, the Socialist-Pacifist Movement in America is an absolutely fundamental and integral part of international socialism. So it has an unproven claim at the top, and then just a bunch of lines, right? And it seems dumb, and there's no evidence behind it. But this document totally splintered the women's movement. And you might be unsurprised to see that where all those lines connect is in the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So that little kind of star radiating out from the bottom, that's WILPF, right? Painted as the center of this vast international communist conspiracy that women were running. Right. And I know that the print is very small, so you may be wondering, like, what kind of women's organizations were in here? Well, Women's Joint Congressional Committee, the Women's Joint Congressional Committee is on the list as part of that vast socialist conspiracy, right? The National Congress of Mothers on the list. The American Home Economics Association. The American, let me just say that one more time. The American Home Ec Association, part of the vast international communist conspiracy, right? So what you had were like very mainstream women's organizations joined by lines, right, to the organizations that actually were very progressive, right? Like WILPF, like the National Women's Trade Union, right? The Women's Committee for World Disarmament, you know, and it was devastating. Like, the red baiting was devastating. And those mainstream organizations basically repudiated, like ran in the other direction, right? So any hope of sort of coalition across women's organizations really got broken when this came out. But now remember, I still have not found this in my searching. I have been to now multiple archives. I've been in the National Archives a million times. I've done searches in so many different ways. I'm trying to find a copy of this document. Okay. On my very, very, very last day in DC, my last time in the archives before I was coming back to California, I saw this phrase, the Socialist-Pacifist Movement in America, 1923. And I thought, I wonder what that is. And I thought I better put a call in for it, even though I was kind of running out of time, and you put the call in, then it takes them a while to like find the things and bring it back to you, you know? And it was like Office of the Director of Intelligence. And I was like, I don't know, I'm not sure, but I gotta see what it is. It's my last chance. I gotta see, it's my last day. I gotta see, right? So next slide. They bring me a box like this. I am sitting at a table there's like a big reading room, you know what I mean? And it's full of people. And I gotta tell you, they did never seem as excited as me about whatever they were being handed. Like I was always like gleeful, like I wanted to tap somebody to be like, oh my gosh, you'll never guess what I'm looking at right now. But like that was not the atmosphere in there. It was not a joyous atmosphere. So I opened this box and there it was, the spider web, which was not labeled the spider web and which I would never have found. It felt like like a miracle, like a historical miracle that I found. And I stood up. And I looked around because I wanted to tell somebody, like, it's right here. This is the spider web. I have the spider web right in front of me, but nobody cared. And there was nobody to tell. But I know you can empathize with what it felt like when I finally ran across this document, and it was all like chewed up and yellowed and, you know, behind plastic. And it was the real thing. It was the original. There it was right there in front of me, in my hands. I did not walk out with it because that would have been a federal crime, but I was amazed. I was amazed. So let's look at some of the details here. Next slide. I think I have just some shots. So these are shots I was taking of the real thing, right? Up close and personal. Compiled by Lucia Maxwell, who once again was Amos Fry's secretary, the head of the Chemical Warfare Service, compiled this, right? And then you can see those pernicious lines, right? Creating this like sense of fear, just out of nothing, just by putting that caption at the top, right? League of Women Voters, General Federation of Women's Clubs, right? Once again, part of the vast communist conspiracy, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Women's Joint Congressional Committee. It's just amazing, really. The National Council for the Prevention of War. Yeah, if Bolshevism fails, it will be because we could not get enough women interested. Little Lenin quote there at the bottom, just to like add some, you know, like just to spin the web of just fiction, right? Just to create out of nothing, right? This implication that women were going to bring down the US government with their vast socialist conspiracy. 1923 compiled, you can see the little date right there at the very, very, very bottom. And then Lucia Maxwell wanted to put her own little spin on it. So, and I thought the Raging Grannies might appreciate this in a like evil twin bizarro world type of way. She wrote a little song about when Miss Bolsheviki came to town with a Russian cap and a German gown. In women's clubs, she's sure to be found, for she's come to disarm America. I don't know what the tune would have been. Oh, it's so good though. She sits in judgment on Capitol Hill and watches the appropriation bill. Without her okay, it passes nil, for she's there to disarm America. She uses the movie and the Lyceum too, and alters textbooks to suit her view. She prates propaganda from pulpit and pew, for she's bound to disarm America. The male of the species has a different plan. He uses the bomb and the firebrand and it incites class hatred wherever he can, while she's busy disarming America. His special stunt is arousing the mob to expropriate and hate and kill and rob, while she's working on her political job. Awake, arouse America. You can see also on this image that also the Spiderweb chart did call out some women in particular. Yeah. You know, so just to note that. And it is in this time period, of course, that the US government considers, the War Department considered Jane Addams the most dangerous woman in America, which, you know, you love also because she had been seen as Saint Jane for a good part of the early 1900s, right? And so when this went national, the repercussions were vast. And I think, like, in part why it took another 40 years for the women's movement to really get going again, right? And red baiting has been used as a tool against progressivism since, right? Like, it worked. That's part of the point I want to make, that it totally worked, right? The War Department was doing PR around the country. They were doing like military parades, getting rah, rah, rah. There's like this great footage where they would they had like movies that were going out that like you might see before you went to the motion pictures. And then they literally had a speaking tour, like generals and, all sorts of high ranking officials were literally doing a speaking tour around the country, smearing feminist pacifists as socialists, right? And then simultaneously having the women under surveillance, and then compiling this document, which then gets leaked, right? And then gets published in the Dearborn Independent, and then picked up by local newspapers all across the country. Yeah, and it works, right? Like, when I just want to I want to convey to you, like, in my own journey, I was in the National Archives in the summer of 2016. Okay. Like, I was like finding out about how the total fictitious manufacturing of lies repeated over and over and over again, right, by the state and covered by the news as if it was true, right, broke the women's movement. And they didn't know how to counter it. They were writing articles like, this isn't true, right? They couldn't counter the propaganda, the fake news, right? They thought that reason would win the day, right? If there was no evidence, then how could this be successful? But they don't need evidence, right? So it was like, just personally, right? Such a kind of a amazing, weird thing to be sort of in my mind 100 years in the past, and to be seeing that same past just echoing, you know what I mean? Our racist immigration policy, the fact that Stephen Miller considered Madison Grant, who wrote the 1924 Quota Act, a personal hero, right? Like that. As cops have been tear gassing protesters on the street, it was Amos Fry's, right, 100 years ago, who introduced tear gas, right, to our police force. That, like, here I am in the archives studying these things, and we have been living those things, right? That, like, appeals to what it is to be America first, like, is literally language of, I didn't show you any of the documents from the conservatives of the time, but that also, like, image after image of America first, right? Just over and over again. And, and then here we are, right, in 100 years later. And just so many of the things repeating. Now, a fun little coda, I don't know, weird little coda. If you go to the next slide, and then I'm just about done, and I'd love to hear your comments. There's the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom right there. At the center. And then Florence Kelly, who really was a radical, bless her heart, man. I love Florence Kelly. She's amazing. The National Women's Trade Union, the National Congress of Mothers and Parent Teachers Associations. Got to watch out for those PTAs, everybody. Bringing down the federal government with the revolutionary ways. Next slide. Okay. So fast forward to 2018, I'm like working on a rough cut of this film. I'm like thinking, you know what? It would be super cool to get some music from the time period. And a lot of this is in the public domain now from that time period, right? And so, you know, there was a peace activist song that was, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. Yeah. But then I ran across this conservative rebuttal to that. I didn't raise my boy to be a slacker, which is what they referred to as folks who were resisted the draft. And I'm looking at this piece of sheet music and just notice who it is written by. Mrs. Amos Fry. Mrs. Amos Fry. It is amazing. It is a small world. You know what I mean? It's a small world. And so if you go to the next slide, this is the sheet music written by Mrs. Amos Fry of the rousing song, I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Slacker. It's been years since I've known how to read music, but it is like a thing that I love about doing historical research like this is that there's just, I cannot account for the serendipity of this. You know what I mean? That like, I was looking for time period music and then I come across sheet music that's literally written by the wife of one of the primary villains in this tale. And that is amazing. And there were so many moments like that.
Did
so
this
many
come before the other version of the song?
I think it came after, but that's a good question.
She's claiming to have written the music and everything.
Yeah. Well noted, Joan. Well noted. Yes. So we can come off of SlideShare. Those are, I mean, that was a lot of slides to look at. But I wanted to give you just some little sense of the journey, and mostly to invite you to like dig in a little on that time period, because it is such a parallel to now. And for me, like I learned almost nothing about it in school, almost nothing. Like there would be a reference to the first Red Scare, but that's about it. But the kind of blueprint of the really 100 years of conservatism was laid in this time period. And also, by the way, it was another moment of serendipity because I had not realized, like, J. Edgar Hoover, right, and the COINTELPRO program, I was pretty familiar with. I had, studied the Civil Rights Movement. I had not realized that he actually cut his teeth in this time period. Like, he honed. That is really like this idea about surveilling progressive activism really starts in 1919. And J. Edgar Hoover was like a baby. I mean, like, you should see how fresh-faced he was.
Right, 19.
Yeah. And that was also.
When did he retire?
Say that again.
When did he retire?
It was
2000s sometime.
Yeah, I mean, he went a long time, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably at least 75-year career. And oh my God, no wonder it was so messed up.
And what is especially pernicious about J. Edgar Hoover is that, so the Palmer raids happened, which is like part of the first Red Scare. The government basically like totally violated a bunch of people's civil rights. And then that was kind of an embarrassment. There was a backlash against it. And then the new boss came in to clean house, and Hoover pretended as if he had been against that, even though he hadn't. And that is how he got his promotion. Oh, he is terrible.
So the UnAmerican Womanhood book by Kim Nielsen.
Yes.
Yeah. So does that cover? Well, I made a note that she includes the Spiderweb
Yes.
in that, and that's where you found out about it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, she goes into much more depth about both the ways in which anti-feminism and kind of pro-American sentiment get intertwined. Right. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, and some of the reasons for that, and including some of the women who were also actively anti-feminist during that. So like red baiting, the first Red Scare, and anti-feminism. It's a super interesting analysis. Shirley, yeah.
I loved your talk because I was a history major, so I kind of like, and I've been a WILPF member for a long, long time. Did you ever go to the WILPF exhibit at the De Anza College, California History Center?
I sure did.
A lot of
even
the
did a talk
of our branch helped put it together because they needed, exhibit materials.
Yeah.
So, great.
Yeah,
It's
no,
too
and I
bad
had
we
done a
didn't
little
come
talk about,
together earlier.
yes, yeah,
We had seen that.
yeah. No, I had used that exhibit to do a little talk about this stuff back then. I was nowhere near kind of as far along on the film as I,
Well,
as,
it was actually to honor the 100th year history
yeah,
of WILPF. So it really did not focus on the spider webs, but that
yeah,
is a very, that red baiting and is really scary. And it's
yes,
been going on for so long that they pick on progressives and they pick on women in
yes,
this case who are, anti-war from the get-go.
yes,
So,
yes,
so I've been determined to say a little bit more in front of people. I usually am very quiet, but like this Fleet Week that just happened
Hi,
last week,
Sylvia. This is.
there's a lot of patriotic talk.
I'm okay. I'm semi-watching a Zoom, but all day long I've been saying I gotta call Sylvia. I gotta call Sylvia. I must have.
keep going, Shirley.
Sorry, I muted that person.
But I things like Fleet Week,
Yeah,
the way I look at it is not a show of patriotic power
yeah,
in the United States. I look at it as a recruiting tool for the military, and that's
Yep.
exactly what it is. And it
Yeah.
costs plenty of money.
yes, yes, yeah. No, I'm so with you. I love the line. I like I said, I used to assign my students Jane Addams as If Men Were Seeking the Franchise, which is one of my favorite things she's ever written. It's so funny. It's so biting. And I think she, I don't know, what's the one thing I talked to Louise Knight about is that her kind of mythos is always so serious, but she was very funny and she was fun to be around. You know what I mean? Like she was, I don't know. I feel like it's like a kind of dehumanization that happens when you're such a towering figure. But that piece, she has just makes me think, Shirley, Fleet Week, like she has that line about they would shoot off a $20,000 cannon, just to hear the boom, basically, I mean, like just like, like a toy. And I just think it is Fleet Week. Like, you're so right. It's a total recruiting tool, but also like just a display. As if those things are toys in a way.
It's men's toys usually.
Yeah.
A few women are thrown in
Yeah.
to give the mix a little bit of acknowledgement that women exist
Right.
in the military.
Yes.
But there's so many cases of women who are treated horribly.
Yes.
So it's
Yeah.
it's an ongoing problem.
Yeah.
But thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, Jen.
Woo, yes.
I want me to say one other thing that I think is a parallel between now is that like part of what made the feminist pacifists so threatening is how much they wanted to reduce the military budget and reinvest into social services, which we are seeing now, right? With defund the police, you know what I mean? So there just is, you know what I mean? That this thing, I think there's so many connections across that. Yeah.
Right.
Anyone else want to share comments or reactions? Yeah. Go ahead, Paula.
So just FYI, Edgar Hoover died in 1972.
Okay.
So
we love a fact check.
He was at the FBI for, I think, something like, let me see, 37 years.
Uh-huh.
Yes, 37 years of J. Edgar Hoover. So we have an opportunity coming up because Jane Addams brought honor to Illinois. This is a declaration. We did a Jane Addams Day, and this is from the Lieutenant Governor of Illinois, because Jane Addams brought honor to Illinois by winning the first Nobel Peace Prize ever awarded to an American woman.
Yep.
And they did this little proclamation, and I don't know how many of us remember that in 2010, we did a Jane Addams Day. It was, let me see, what did we, Meg Bowman was Jane Addams. Anybody remember that? Oh, goodness gracious. And we talked about her being a garbage inspector. She had lots of things we did. It was
at the senior housing. Cypress Senior Housing Place, is that the one?
No, we did it at the Peace Center.
Oh, okay.
Here we did. Here's the invitation. So I have an archive if this is something we need to keep, folks. I don't know, is it? Is this what counts as archival material?
It does, yes.
Okay, well, I'm happy to put it in somebody else's archive.
Well, we haven't, we'll work on either the San Jose State or the Swarthmore.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, anyway,
That's awesome.
we did honor Jane Addams back then, but I'm just delighted to have this, both the personal experience of here's how you search for information that is really obscure.
Yeah.
You know, but
I have a song by Paula Rochelle, Jane Addams song that Paula wrote,
Oh my
and we
goodness.
sang.
Maybe it was-
I don't have that on the program. Wait a minute. What? I don't remember that. So, well,
I
it's
have a
nice.
song in my songbook.
Oh my goodness. Well, I'll have to look and see if we should have sung it tonight.
Yeah, Jane Addams, something like
To
that.
Moon River.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I wondered why the lyrics to Moon River are in my archive. It's like,
Yeah,
wow.
Moon River. Yeah.
Okay, well, somebody else can have this archive for this meeting that we did.
Oh,
I
that's
think I
amazing.
also spoke at the Jane Addams Remembrance.
Yes, you
I
did,
spoke
Essie.
about the Persian ladies, how at that same time what they were doing,
Mhm.
Yes.
progressive woman in Iran.
Yeah,
Wait.
that's awesome.
We also ate your lentils that night.
Yeah, I guess.
Anyway, it's just wonderful to have these
Memories.
more details about a really unique period of time and how WILPF was seen as something so central to it all. Because now you talk about WILPF and some people haven't heard about it.
Yes.
And so it's really interesting. Back in 2010, when we were doing the WILPF program, I asked my book group when it was my turn to choose a book, I said, read anything by or about Jane Addams. And they were like, who's Jane Addams?
Oh no.
Yeah.
You know? And so it was really interesting to, you know, I left it wide open, and every once in a while you'll see in like newspaper columns, opinion columns, they'll name people who were real peace activists, and Jane Addams' name is often there.
Yeah.
And yet, you know, it's at this point, she's not very well known.
How can we put her in the school curriculum? Like children can read about her.
Well, there is a junior high school book written by a woman whose last name is Burson. I don't remember her first name, but she wrote a junior high school book. Anybody want? I have a library. I have a shelf on Jane Addams, and it needs
Someone needs to write a children's picture book about her. Someone right here in this room.
That would be interesting. Yeah.
Okay, Shirley, you're our artist. And you and Rowan are the
Actually,
artists in that.
I remember our WILPF branch used to have a recruiting brochure, and we used to say that Jane Addams was America's most dangerous woman, and it says, "We like Jane."
Yes.
Do you remember the T-shirt that Will Fresno put out? I don't have the energy to run upstairs and get it, but it's got the postage stamp on the front of it, and it says, maybe Rowan remembers this too. It says, "Ask me why I'm a dangerous woman." And And it always gets conversation going. And people don't see the stamp, but there's the stamp. I think it's a 2-cent stamp. Does anybody remember that? Anyway,
She has a stamp.
do you have it?
I don't, well, I have a few things. A friend of mine keeps giving me Jane-related objects.
Oh,
yeah.
So
Nice.
this really makes me laugh for the irony. They literally named a warship after her. Look at that, the SS Jane Addams.
Oh my goodness.
Liberty ship. You know, I'm like, you just gotta, I mean, the
That's
militarism cannot be beat, right? It's just amazing. And then this is a, let's see if I can make this come through.
Yeah.
This is an old spoon, Jane Addams spoon. And I
Somebody's
think this
holding
is
it.
1893, like a commemoration of the World's Fair in Chicago. And then I am someone who, much like y'all probably, likes to proselytize Jane Addams. So a friend of mine recently made me a little card that's from Jane to me. Sup, Jen? Yeah. So, but I do not have a stamp. Although, well, actually, this I can't tell. I would need not just my reading glasses, but like an act. Oh, it is. This is the Jane Addams stamp on this very same warship. There it is. Yeah. Yeah.
This has been so interesting, Jen. I love the content, your enthusiasm,
Yes.
the depth of your scholarship on this. It's really amazing. And I, for one, want the secret link to see the full movie, to see the.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think if everybody here, I don't know how, Rowan, you're our tech maven. How would we do that?
Do you
Well,
want me to
email later.
email? Okay.
Okay.
I can do, I will send it to Rowan and Paul, and you can figure out how to get it out.
Okay. That's.
I will warn you, it is a rough cut in that, like, I had a friend who's a reader of my films watch it, and usually she tells me how I can cut 20 minutes out. And in this case, she's like, no, you need to add 20 minutes because it's too fast. So I'll just wonder. It is, but it does give you the full story, and you'll get to see lots more of the archival imagery and the film footage and things like that. So anyway, it's I will appreciate it having some viewers even in its very, very nascent rough stage.
The fans of Jane Addams Club.
Yes.
All right.
We're an excellent audience for that.
Yes. So I want to just do a Zoom shout out and appreciation, however you do it, to Jen. Everybody, it really was a splendid evening. Thank you so much for offering it to us.
My pleasure.
I really, really appreciate it. And I'm going away just in awe of Jane Addams and you and this document. And I posted a clip of it on our meetup site, and I'm not sure where. I must have found that on the web someplace.
Yeah.
So there's digital renditions of it out there, but I'll have to look more closely because I didn't get the WILPF part. I didn't get that bottom part.
Yeah.
Now I know much more. I want to announce that our next WILPF meeting, which is our traditional gather for Thanksgiving, a shared meal, our membership meeting, nothing is normal, but we have a wonderful program planned. So Shirley previously did a bit of her history at one of our meetings. So it turns out that it's really important to get the history of activists so that we don't lose those histories. So we got a bit of Shirley's, and guess who's next? Joan Goddard has agreed to be our next one. When I found out that Joan was at the MLK I Have a Dream gathering. I don't know what else to call it.
March on
That's what I
Washington.
call it. I said, hey, we need to hear your history. So she is going to, and I think we're going to record it so we have it and we can archive it. And we'll get a transcript made somehow. Who knows? The magicians with technology will figure it out. And so we will be interviewing Joan Goddard about her history. So come support Joan, learn a little bit about how Joan, who's on the national, involved nationally with WILPF, how she got going early in her life.
And we'll hear about all the rest of you.
And then we want to hear from others because we don't want to lose these histories.
Right.
When is Joan's next time?
Next meeting, and I think that meeting is November 19th. So write it down. Third Friday, November 19th. Spread the word. It's time to share. You know, we're not getting younger. Did anybody notice? So we better get these histories. We better get these histories archived. So that's next time.
And this
December.
This is inspired by the Palo Alto Peninsula member leader Judy Addams, who did a major oral histories project with several people involved with it through San Jose State and Stanford, and it includes lots and lots of WILPF women in this area, and it was done 20 years ago or something. Anyway, the results are at Stanford in their collection, and she's written a book about it. I think it's called Peace Women. Is that right? Yeah, Judy Addams. So she's encouraging us. She said, okay, I did a program at the Congress this summer for WILPF, and who's working on it now? Let's get on it. So Paula said, okay.
So, yeah, so this is an invitation to both attend and spread the word. And we'll put it on our meetup site. And from there, our tech maven, social media maven, Rowan spreads it around. Now I'm going to go look at my archive and see if I can find the song to about Jane Addams.
Yeah, let's put it back in our repertoire.
Thank you, Jen.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. Nice to see you, Roberta. We can now see you. It's nice to see you. Nice to see everyone. All right.
Roberta.
So much. Good to see everyone.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming. See you next month.